All right, we're on. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Welcome back.
It's good to see you both.
Yeah. Today we're talking about characteristics of effective leaders. Robert, I think you're a great person to talk to about this, and you have a lot of knowledge in the emails that we've sent back and forth. You had some suggestions about characteristics and also asked us to come up with some examples of leaders that we think have been effective. You want to start us off?
Sure. And I would like to, as I was thinking about this conversation ahead of time, one of the things that really occurred to me, I think, and we've talked before about the fact I'd recently rebranded all my work to this idea of excellent decisions and helping people make decisions based on their vision and their values, rather than all the stress and pressure that a lot of us are faced with in today's world. And it leads me into leadership work. And it really connects very deeply in my experience to leadership, because when I see people who are doing that, like people who really are clear about their vision and values and lead their life in a way that's driven by their vision and values, to me, by definition, they are a leader. And I think so often we think of people who are leaders and we think about, defining them by the people that are following them. But in many cases, I see people making really, what I consider to be really powerful leadership moves, whether anyone follows them or not. And to me, again, if it's driven by vision and values, if the decisions we're making and the actions we're taking, the way we show up in the world is driven by our vision and values, then we are, by definition, a leader. And, again, to me, just leading into this conversation, talking about what an effective leader is, for me, that's a big part of the framework. I think it was Stephen Covey who said, he who is good with a hammer thinks everything is a nail. So for me, it's kind of like that. Like I look at everything through that lens of excellent decisions. And so much of my work comes down to working with people on getting clear about their own vision and values so that they can have more of that experience. And I think it leads to people being able to become more effective leaders. So, I also did look at some of the characteristics, and we can certainly go back and forth on this. I'll share mine, and you guys can share others that you feel should be on the list as well. But when I'm working with leaders, I tend to look at it through the lens of first of all, are they showing up in a powerful way? Are they a powerful person? And again, the word power sometimes kind of gets a bad name in the kind of old school, more masculine style of leadership. You'll do it that way because I told you to. Some of us heard from our fathers when we were young. But to me, there's a really powerful distinction about power in that there's personal power and there's position power. And I like to focus on personal power, which again comes back to that concept of vision and values, and a company or an organization or an individual having a sense of mission and vision and purpose. And that's what's driving the conversation rather than someone who has position power. I mean, a manager or a parent or a person who's in a traditional leadership position has position power, but sometimes the people they're leading in some ways have more of what I call personal power. They get the respect of their coworkers because of the way they show up and what their priorities are. So when I talk about someone being an effective leader by being powerful, I'm not necessarily talking about position power, but really personal power. Is that a distinction that shows up for you guys as well?
I think so, but let me go back to your decisions first. So it occurred to me, one of my favorite stories, I think I tell in one of my books, but Gary Black was the executive VP at Fireman's Fund Insurance, and he was in charge of all claims. So he would decide who got paid, who didn't get paid. And he worked a full career there, and he retired. And at his retirement dinner, he had his family there in the table, and he had his list of accomplishments that he was going to talk about. And he had shared that with his family. And so they sat there as employee after employee got up and talked about Gary and working with Gary. And it went on for a little while, and then his daughter-in-law leaned over and said, "Hey, Gary, they're not saying anything that's on your list." And he goes, "I know." And she said, "All they're talking about is your integrity." And I think about your decisions, and you're talking about excellent decisions in the work that you do. I mean, here was a guy who you think about calling in for insurance on a claim, particularly a business claim, where you might just be put through the ringer to get a dime, or to get anything. And here's the guy at the top And the biggest thing they remember about him, because of the decisions he made, was his integrity. And
Mm-hmm.
he told me later, he was like, if I knew they were focused that much on integrity, I would have emphasized it more. I would have, built it into things more. It was just naturally what I was doing. And I think I agree with you on the decision-making part. When I talk about systematic power and 3 strands leadership, there's 7 attributes. And one of the key things I say is that you're able to make good decisions in a reasonable amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
You don't make them too fast, so you make mistakes. You don't procrastinate and avoid them. But, that kind of leads to that power presence that you were talking about. When you're making tough decisions in a reasonable amount of time, it naturally doesn't it? I mean, it seems to me it naturally then exudes a positive power with the people that you're working with.
For sure. And I think that's a really great example of someone who had both position power in terms of kind of being at the top of the chain, if you will. But what people really remember him for is not the position power elements, what he did, but more the personal power elements, how he did it, the person he was being, as opposed to the things that he was doing. And that's exactly, I think, and again, when we talk about effective leaders, to some degree, I mean, I used to, you guys know this, I used to run a parking company. What you're talking about with that whole claims, like that whole environment, the nature of those conversations, those are not fun conversations. Those are not easy conversations. They're really difficult. They can be very confrontational conversations. They can be conversations that are very difficult to turn into like a win-win kind of a deal. So they're hard, but they're also, that's just what we're doing. Ultimately, how you come out the end of those conversations, and as your example, the end of a career, is driven more by how we do it versus what we do. And again, I think that's a really good example of exactly what I'm talking about personal power being, I think, more important than position power. Because at some point, if you're just exercising position power, if you're just telling people what to do because you're the boss, you're never going to have the respect, you're never going to have the trust, you're never going to have the loyalty, you're never going to be able to create the kind of culture and ultimately the kind of results, because your people will only do what they need to do. They'll do the bare minimum. And in organizations and with leaders, what I see is the organizations and the leaders that get people to go above and beyond are the people that are truly respected, the people that do show up with this level of personal power, connection to vision and values and something more important, rather than just, do it because I told you so kind of position power.
And how many years did you run that, you and your partner run that parking company? I remember you did it for a long time.
Yeah, I was involved with it for almost 15 years. It literally started as a summer job. A friend of mine and I from college who had both had experience working for valet parking companies decided that when we graduated from college, we would just, as a summer job, approach some restaurants and offer to do valet parking for them on the beach in San Diego. And it turned into this whole entrepreneurial odyssey. And it ended up being a great deal. It was very successful. After about 7 years, we had over 400 employees. We were all over Southern California. We were doing restaurants and hotels and special events and, paid parking lots and all this stuff. It was great. But it was really 2 guys trying to figure it out as we went along. And that whole claims kind of element. I mean, I do some customer service work right now. It's actually more culture work, but a little bit of customer service focused work. And I tell the people I'm working with, if you want to sit down and start talking, service recovery stories about the claims side of that whole business, it was crazy sometimes.
Well, you think about the decision piece, and we don't emphasize it much, but a lot of times when you're making those decisions, I mean, other people have agendas. Other people have things they want. You talk about a parking situation, it's like somebody could say, a scratch or a dent was, one of your guys' fault when they've had it for weeks, and how do you deal with that? And how do you roll with that? And that's a biggie. That's those decisions and how you handle yourself and how you handle your emotions. As I would assume at times you're being attacked personally.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You think people take their cars personally? Really?
Yeah. That's interesting. And then moving on to the personal power versus the positional power. I'm kind of curious, Jeff, in your experience, whether you've seen that with different people and the difference.
Oh, thank you for passing the ball to me. I appreciate it.
We're rolling a little bit too much here, and you have some different work experience than ours. So
I was in a different part of the field, part of the court there. So I was waving my hands, but nobody. That's right.
I'm open. I'm
Yeah.
open.
Yeah. No, I wanted to. I'm not sure how to answer that question. So I have a question of my own that I want to pose to you, Robert, and that was kind of the nitty gritty of the difference between personal power and position power. You explained it. But it all seems more ethereal to me without some specific examples. So I understand personal power relates to kind of a way one carries themselves and makes how they make decisions versus a position's power and just the capabilities of someone in a position.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a couple more specifics you could give me. My analytical mind is going to work.
Or examples.
Or sure. And I think the position power one is probably easier to define in the sense that in a typical organizational structure, and this could be a government organization, a company, a for-profit, nonprofit, a family, a school, any kind of organizational structure. There's almost always some sort of hierarchy. There's the person who is assigned a role in the organization as a manager, as an owner, as a founder, as a C-level person, as a supervisor, whatever. There's some sort of title. And it's different in every organization. I'm working with a biotech company down in San Diego right now, and I'm having to learn kind of what their hierarchy is. They started talking about their pod supervisors, and I was like raising my hand saying, what is that? What does that mean? But it was really just a level in their organizational structure. And to me, what position power is if you're at a higher level, you have some position power. You have some authority over, quote unquote, let's give them the structure, over the people who answer to you. So it's really defined by the structure, not by the person. And the personal power one, I think it's a little harder to define, but the best way to understand it is it's not about what you do or about what your title. It's really about how you do it. And, I can think of examples from my own work life, mostly in this work around personal and professional development. For instance, there's a lot of people out there who are coaches and consultants and doing this work, and you see their marketing and you see them on stage, and it's very impressive. And then you get to know them a little better, and you find out that they don't necessarily live the principles that they're sharing from the stage. And to me, what that does is it really erodes their personal power. They may have some position power as being that person on the stage, being the leader, being the person who's the focus of the organization. But if you really get to know them, or if you're one of the people who actually works with them and supports them, and maybe they're on stage teaching everyone how important it is to be kind and caring to other human beings, and then behind stage they're going, what the heck are you doing? I needed my glass of water, and I told you it was supposed to be Evian, and that's the only, and people are going, not feeling that level of respect and like integrity, commitment to what they are teaching. So again, the personal power one is a little harder to really put a definition on. Like the position power one is fairly easy to quantify. But I think the simplest way to look at it is it's not what a person does or what their role is. It's who they really are. It's more of a being versus doing assessment. I mean, there's people like I've checked into hotels and dealt with managers who are just not very nice people. And I've dealt with the front desk clerk who's just charming and nice and caring and looking out for my best interests. And I would say that front desk person has more personal power. I would assess that person as more of like a true leader, someone who I would follow from outside of this organizational structure, than the manager who's, doesn't care and is not treating their employee or me very well. They may have the position power, but they won't get that sense from me of personal power. Influence, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes it more clear for me.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.
But doesn't
And
that play in, Jeff, to one of your favorite leaders with Alan Mulally and what he did over at Ford?
Um,
He wouldn't have been able to pull that off unless he basically walked his talk. I mean, if he didn't live it out, then I don't think he could have pulled it off.
yes, but it's not one of the characteristics I was thinking of when I was going to present him as my answer to our homework.
Yeah, but that's why we have Rob here, so he gives you these additional insights.
There you go. I can keep
that you
taking
need.
stabs and we'll hit. And, I'll be curious to see what your thinking is on that, Jeff. And it's perfectly fine to kind of wait on that, because I'm guessing that when you talk about someone in a highly visible role like that, a CEO of a Fortune 500, very top level company, obviously he has the position power. No question, he's going to have the position power. So I'm curious to know, like your assessment of why he is an effective leader. And I'm guessing it's going to go way beyond the fact that he has that position power. So let me give you my second criteria that I use when we're looking at effective leaders, and we'll see if I can get closer to what your assessment is with
All right.
With the Ford situation. So the second criteria that I look at, and it's another one that's a little different than what we might typically think of as a leader, and it's being open-minded and being a lifelong learner. And I find that people who are willing to approach their team and their organization from a point of view of not being the person who already has all the answers and already knows everything, but is committed to continuing to learn, and in a lot of cases shows up as someone who's willing to ask questions rather than be the type of person who feels like they have all the answers, is a really important quality of an effective leader, of someone who's able to build a culture, get people to, again, go above and beyond, do even more than they might normally be expected to do because they feel inspired by that leader. So that's another criteria that shows up for me. And it shows up in the form of, again, people who are willing to ask questions and show up not feeling like they have all the answers, versus showing up as a person who feels like they do have all the answers. And I have an example for that one. It's actually someone, going back to this experience with the parking company. Here's two college kids starting this company and really not knowing what they're doing. And I remember one of the restaurant companies, it was a small restaurant group with restaurants in Southern California and Hawaii, very successful, but relatively small. And one of the guys who was a partnership, two guys who started the company, and one of them was a guy named Sandy Saxton. And I remember going into a meeting with him about doing some work with them at one of their new restaurants. And, I'm a young kid and I'm feeling like, I'm one of the owners of our company. So I kind of am trying to figure out this whole leadership thing. And I felt like I had to have all the answers. Like I was trying to think of all the questions they were going to ask. And I was feeling like I needed to have all the answers. And he modeled this principle for me because he really, he had a lot more experience. He'd been around a lot longer. He'd been in business a lot longer. I would have thought that he would have had a lot more answers than I would, and he probably did. But he had no need, he had no ego need to prove that to my partner and I. And in fact, in a lot of the conversations that we had, he was willing to pause and ask questions and be thoughtful rather than feel like he needed to be, Professor Impressive and let everyone know how smart he was and how much he knew. He was totally willing to step back from that and be the person who was asking questions instead of having all the answers. So to me, that's a really important characteristic of, someone who is an effective leader, building a great culture and getting great results.
Yeah, I like that one. As someone who, I have books behind me and I like to read a lot, being open-minded and being a lifelong learner sounds like just a natural key to being an effective leader, because you're always going to have to learn about the product, the people that are with you, the people that are, you're partnering with you or working for you, the market and competitors. And I really like that one.
Good.
Yeah. Go for it, Dad. Just let it out.
He looks like he's got
Well,
something.
no, I had something, and the lifelong learner piece. Oh, the point I wanted to make was that I think when you can live that out and you take that approach, you also avoid jumping to assumptions, which is, when I look back on a lot of my mistakes I've made in my career, many of them were based on assumptions, maybe partial truths, maybe just hope for fantasies, whatever. But I think if you take that approach, you ask, you listen, you ask questions, you listen. Also, you talked about personal power. It came across as a lot of personal power for him to be able to just talk with you, and you felt respected.
Mm-hmm.
And he was deciding based on how you answer whether he could trust you, right? I mean, and he didn't jump to a conclusion, for whatever reason. He decided he'd give you the time, he'd give you the opportunity, and through that dialogue he was able to get to know you a little bit better and decide whether he could trust you with a piece of his business. Because if you think about that, as we go and we work with other people, he's making a decision. If you go to a restaurant and the valet people treat you poorly, the food would have to be incredible for you to return.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if the food's just good, the atmosphere is just good, there's a lot of other options. So that piece of the puzzle you guys were providing is a front end, and it's an important decision. And he didn't rush it. So
Right.
asking questions was a smart move.
Well, and you're absolutely right. And for my partner and I, the day that we realized that when our clients were hiring us, especially like a restaurant or hotel, something, but even true with a special event, what they were doing was they were turning over the first and last impression of their customer to us. So like you said, like the restaurant, you walk in, you get greeted by the hostess or host. You have someone who takes you to your table. You have the waiter. You have the cook staff. You have all this work that you're doing. And restaurant business is so hard. Like, to be successful in the restaurant business, to get all those pieces working, to have the right environment, the right people, and the right food, it is hard. And to turn over the first and last impression, because you're right, if the valet screws it up on the way in, or if the valet screws it up on the way out, no matter how good a job they did, chances are they've lost that customer. And for my partner and I, the day we really started looking at our business that way was the day, I think it was a fundamental game changer for us to have that level of awareness and to share that with our team, that we were not just parking cars. We were responsible for the first and last impression of that restaurant or that party host or that hotel. Their customer that they were working so hard, they were trusting us with the first and last impression, which was so critical. And the other thing you said, I think, is a really important element of this conversation about this particular characteristic is the timing element of it. If you are a lifelong learner, and if you are the person who doesn't feel like they have to have the answers, and in that particular meeting with Sandy Saxon, I remember how uncomfortable it was when he paused. Like, for me, it was uncomfortable. Like, he's a really smart guy. He's a really sophisticated guy. He was willing to pause. He was willing to take his time and be thoughtful and ask questions and make sure he had all the information, rather than, again, trying to prove to us how smart he was and rush that decision. And I agree with what you were saying, Dave, about the fact that sometimes when we rush decisions, first of all, we don't have all the information that we possibly could. And we just don't have time to go through the layers of, sorting through the possibilities to make a sound decision. So the fact that we don't feel like we have to have the answers, one of the real benefits of that is it does buy us time. It gives us a little more time to be thoughtful and consider all our options before we rush into a decision. Because sometimes when we make a decision, it's hard to go back on it. So absolutely true.
I love the name Sandy Saxton. That's really good. Sounds like a character.
He was an amazing guy. He was, again, someone, relatively small restaurant group in California and Hawaii. Most people probably haven't heard of him. But for me, in terms of the way I try to show up as a leader, I will literally never forget that meeting that we went into with him. And my experience of it, as someone, again, position power. He had the position power in this meeting, but what I walked out with was an incredible impression of the personal power and who he was as a person, as opposed to his position and the influence that came from that.
So powerful, personal power versus position power is the first one. Being open-minded is the second one. What's the third one?
The third one will surprise nobody who's familiar with me and my work, and I already launched into my little soapbox, but it's being vision and values driven. So for organizations and for leaders, the importance of having clarity of vision and values. And a lot of people ask me when I talk about vision and values, well, what about mission and purpose and things like that? My personal belief is, and I don't think this is just driven by the fact that the vision and values is the language I've spent a lot of time using, but in my experience, if a person is really clear about their vision, like what they're trying to create and how it influences all the different areas of their life or their organization, and their values, like why it's really important to them, then those two things together is what creates a sense of mission and purpose. There's so much great work out there about finding your purpose. I just keep thinking, if someone does the work to get really clear about their values, what's really important to them, and they also do the work about creating a powerful vision that's in alignment with those values, those two things put together would be their purpose. Fulfilling, making that vision a reality would be their purpose. So those two building blocks would make it up. And to me, in order to be an effective leader and to be in that place of really showing the personal power, and again, getting people to go above and beyond and creating a culture where, you know, teams and people just love to be a part of it, having clarity of vision and values throughout the organization is a critical part of that. I think people will do amazing things for individuals that they really respect and trust. But when there's something bigger, when there is that sense of purpose and mission and vision, people who are working for organizations and people like that, to me, are the people who bounce out of bed in the morning and can't wait to get to work. I know for me, I love the work I do. There's a sense of vision of being in alignment with my values, doing what I'm here to do. So most days, largely directed by whether I stayed up too late the night before, when I wake up or when the alarm goes off, I'm pretty excited to get into my office and get to do the work that I do. And again, I just feel like it's driven by that sense of clarity of vision and values. Not surprising to anyone, right?
I think this is where Alan Mulally comes in. I was
knew he
looking at
would.
the list.
I knew we'd get to him.
Yeah. And it's I think more along I was thinking more along the lines of vision than values, but that's just something that I focus on because of his success with Ford. Obviously it must have been driven by his values as well. So it can't be ignored. You know, when he started at Ford in 2006, he was hired by Bill Ford and the board there to turn around Ford. Ford stock was close to $1 or something like that. They were really in the dumps. And Alan came in, Mr. Mulally came in to Ford, and
I'm sure he wouldn't mind us calling him Alan.
Yeah, we're on a first name basis. We're good buddies. He came into Ford and he had this clear vision of what to do to fix it. I'm sure they were considering multiple candidates, and I can only imagine the interviews, him coming in and saying, listen, this, you know, here's what I want to do. And his plan was essentially to cut off, you know, sell off the businesses that weren't working. He sold off Jaguar, and there was one other one, and consolidate around 3 brands. And he called it the One Ford Plan. And he just had this incredible vision of open-mindedness to ask a lot of questions along the way to bring Ford back to focus on what it was really good at. And in 2014, you know, he left the company, and over 8 years, he had made an incredible difference, as many people know. And that was something that I really found powerful in analysis of his leadership style, is that he didn't come in and just had this incredible exuberance and positivity and here we go, rah, 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 we're going to do this. No, he said, I'm going to be open to changes, but I have this vision of where this company can go and how we can succeed and how we can pull ourselves up. And 3 months after he was hired, he was sitting in front of major banks, stumping for the company, asking for a $20 billion loan, which they got, which carried them through the recession and allowed them to say no to government bailouts. And that just speaks to me as evidence that he was prepared. He knew what he was doing. He was ready to go. And he supposedly carried around laminated cards with one Ford written on them. And he was just driven by this vision and this plan for the company. And he, I think that cascaded down through everyone else, at least from the reports and articles that I've read, that it was really powerful. So yeah, vision and values is the biggest one that kind of hit me, that when thinking about leadership, characteristics of effective leaders. If you don't have someone who knows where they're going and why they're doing it, and how they're going to do it, it's going to be a rough road.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's very interesting because if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mulally was CEO of Boeing before he went to Ford.
He was a vice president, I think.
He was only a VP?
I believe so. I can look it up.
Yeah, you can look it up while we're talking. So check it on the internet. But I do think, and really, he didn't have just a card that said, one Ford. He had one team, one goal, one plan, and then he had statements underneath that, and it was a full vision that Rob's talking about. And then he lived it out. I mean, I didn't read a lot of situations that he was in, but I do remember one of the funniest ones for me and most impactful was shortly after he took on the position, he joined some engineers who were meeting with Consumer Reports on the new Ford Escape. I believe it was the Ford Escape. And the Consumer Reports people were ripping the car to shreds. And the engineers were arguing with them, trying to justify, all of Ford's design flaws. And one of the flaws was that Consumer Reports, one of the testers was not very tall, and she couldn't pull down the hatch in the back. And it was I think after that engineer arguing why it made sense it was that high or whatever, that Mulally, I don't think it went on very long that they were arguing. Mulally turned to the engineer and she said, "Okay, I want all of you to be quiet. You are not to say anything anymore except to ask questions, and you take notes on everything they say. You will not argue anything else." And you think about that because he had the clear vision. Once again, he had the positional power, going back to Rob's stuff. He also had the personal power. I mean, he could have argued with him, even though he's new, okay? And he had the right timing for the decision. He was maybe hoping the engineers would stop a few times in. But, here's a guy who really lived it out. And he had tremendous vision, like you brought up, Jeff. If he hadn't have gotten those loans, and it was it 20 billion or 25? I mean, it was
20 billion.
Yeah, it was a massive number. It shows you how profitable the car business can be, the fact that he paid it off. But I mean, it's a huge thing. You talk about right guy for the time. I don't know whether anybody else would have pulled it off.
Well, and what came out of that conversation about the tailgate too? Like once the conversation stopped and wasn't like an arguing and a back and forth and trying to defend my point of view, I'm thinking I know what came out of that conversation in terms of something that Ford innovated, right?
Yeah. And well, then they made changes.
Yeah, they have that crazy thing now where you can wave your foot underneath the bumper and you can open or close the tailgate.
Yeah.
And then to me, again, it's a perfect example of what a powerful leader can do in terms of keeping the conversation going in a different kind of way. So much, I mean, it's really interesting for me just in this conversation. I hadn't thought about it that much ahead of time, but there's a very typical, again, kind of a more masculine, old school, you'll do it that way because I told you to do it that way, because I'm in charge, because I'm the boss kind of management style. But it's, to me, is very ego driven. But what we're talking about here, and today's a different world where honestly, people complain about millennials and they won't stay at their job or whatever. Well, some of that is because companies have cultures where young people are realizing they don't have to stay there. They're not married to that job. They're valuable. They can go get a job somewhere else if they don't like the culture or the leadership or whatever it might be. So that kind of style is not going to work anymore. And to me, we're talking about a lot of ways that are kind of outside of that box, looking at being open-minded and asking questions versus just telling people what to do, and focusing on personal power versus position power, and coming from a place of bigger vision. And what it does is it creates these kinds of situations where a different conversation happens. Instead of arguing about why the tailgate is as high as it is and explaining why you did it or whatever, there's a solution called, what could we do to fix this problem? And I love what Ford came up with. I think they were the first ones to do that. There's a lot of companies that do it now. But this, this magical thing where if you have your key in your pocket and you're close enough and, you're not just some stranger walking by, you can actually just wave your foot underneath the bumper and the tailgate will open itself or close itself. And I'm guessing it may have come right out of that conversation that you're talking about.
Well, and the interesting thing too is that Mulally could have taken 5 minutes and just berated the engineers and just ripped them to shreds because he had positional power.
Yes.
If he wanted to be the dictator or whatever, I mean, he could have just attacked them personally. He didn't do that.
Yes.
I think I said more than what I read he said. I mean, basically what he said, to put it bluntly, what I remember reading is, from now on, you guys shut up. I just want you to take notes. And I don't know what the exact words were, but it was brief, to the point, didn't attack them, but it was like, you need to learn, like you're talking. Brilliant guy for the turnaround. And then he also, eased himself out, however many years ago. And I think it's a woman who's CEO or chairman now, isn't it now?
No.
I thought a woman was way near the top.
The current
Jeff's got the
CEO
entire
James Hackett
and history of Ford leadership on the screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got any women in the top leadership roles? I thought there was a woman up there.
I don't have the full list of presidents and vice presidents at Ford, but I know Jim Hackett is the CEO right now, and it's Alan Mulally, I believe, just for the pronunciation.
Sorry, I probably
he's a friend of mine. I got to stick up for him.
Yeah. Now, I also want you to think about, if we go back to Rob's situation, with the car parking, I think it was a gal who worked for Land's End who originally came up with this phrase. She calls it experience bookends, Rob. And so, you have a client experience, or you have an experience with anybody, and you have a beginning and an end, and you want to make those really strong, really positive, because it gets messy in the middle.
Yeah.
And in the same way, I mean, I'm sure that I think great leaders are good at starting strong, going through the mess in the middle in a respectful way, and then closing strong and sincerely. You can't do all this if you're insincere, if you're manipulative. People read it, people see it.
Yeah, it doesn't fly anymore, for sure. And I think that idea of bookends absolutely applies to what Jeff described happening at Ford, in the sense that he comes in as this new person, and there's a clear assessment of where we're at now and what we maybe need to do first. But there's also that sense of vision. Like, the other bookend to me is a sense of where we're going. And it sounds like, the whole one Ford, and I forget what the other ones were, but there were multi, this kind of strategy around that. There was some sense of that. But the truth is, between where we're at now and getting clear about that, and then this vision that we have, it does get messy. Things don't always go exactly the way we plan. We get into action, we get feedback, we respond to that feedback. We think we know what's going to happen. It goes completely differently. That's just called life and business. But I agree with you completely that the clarity about like where we're going to start, which a big part of that to me is like where we're at now, what's working, what's not working, what needs to be changed, what are our strengths, what are we going to use to make this change, the assessment of where we're at now, and then also the vision of where we want to go. And you're right, in the middle, things don't typically go exactly the way, and the bigger the project, the more things don't typically go the way we want them to go. But again, a good leader is going to stay focused on the ultimate goal. And I think your story about that meeting with a group of engineers that was not in the realm of how we would want things to go, it sounds like the person in the real leadership position was the one who got it back on track. Let's keep our eye on the ball here. This is a conversation that, although it's uncomfortable, might be a really great thing in terms of helping us get where we want to go. Because if we don't know what our problems are, how can we fix them? I had the opportunity to work for a long time with Jack Canfield, and Jack does a really great exercise about responding to feedback. And one of the things that's embedded in that is that there's really only two kinds of feedback. A lot of times people are very resistant to getting negative feedback. They only want positive feedback. But the question embedded in that is, have you ever gotten value from negative feedback, from someone being critical? And of course, the answer is yes. Sometimes we get even more valuable feedback, from the negative stuff than we do from people telling us how great we are while the walls are falling down around us. So I think that, again, that's a really good example of someone keeping their eye on that bookend at the end, on that sense of vision, what the ultimate goal is, rather than the mess we might be in at this current moment.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of interesting to think about what Mulally's, did I pronounce it right that way, Jeff? I don't want to offend your
That's
friend.
closer. It's better.
Okay, thank
Good
you.
job.
Maybe I just call him Alan, baby sweetheart. What his expectation was going in. So often as leaders that I work with, they have this expectation that's off the charts, much higher than their expectation for their own behaviors. If they were in the role of another person, and you see this in parenting too, but I want to keep it on the business side, but the expectation is just too high. And so they get upset when they didn't need to get upset. The expectation was too high. They should have adjusted that, and so they could help get from point A to point B in the conversation or the situation or whatever.
All right. Powerful, open-minded values, vision and values driven.
All right, someone's taking notes. I love it.
Yep.
Well, wait a minute. I'm not ready to go past vision values.
Oh,
I got two zingers for Rob here first.
Thought we were ready to move on, Dad. Come on.
No, this is critical, and this plays to everything that Rob does, I think, okay, because you talk about decisions. I think there's two major parts to defining this vision and values, okay? So one is and I'd like you to speak to both of them, Rob, whether or not you use examples. One is the piece of putting them together, of defining them. This is not turning on a light bulb, okay? This is, I know you work with clients, and you don't just walk in and say, oh yeah, your vision should be X and your values should be Y, and now thank you very much, and you're gone in 15 minutes. So I'd like you to talk about what is that process, how long can it take? I'm sure there's a range. Some people can do it in X and some people Y. But the other part that I think is even more important and is where most leaders fail is that even if they get the vision and values in place, they're not creating new habits to live them out. And if you don't live them out, you can have the greatest, Enron had them in bronze on the wall of their building, what their values were. They were great. They didn't live them out. So if you could talk to those two pieces, because this is so critical, what you're talking about with great leadership, you know where you're going and how you get there, but then you also have to develop these new habits, systems, processes, whatever. And that is the daily grind. That is the weekly grind, and maybe grind is, you can enjoy it, but if you talk to those two pieces, I'd really like to hear what your experience has been.
Well, Jeff, he didn't want to move on to the next characteristic, but he's actually teeing it up perfectly without even knowing that he's doing it. So this is perfect.
All right.
And I think you use the word process, which I think is really critical to answering the question. And you're right, you don't go in. First of all, no one as an outsider can come into an organization and tell them what their vision and values are or should be. It's a process of asking a lot of questions and helping an individual or an organization discover their own, connect more deeply to their own sense of vision and values. So it is a process. And it truly, in my experience, never ends, because as we develop a vision and then get into this process of trying to make it a reality, getting into action and making it a reality, it's going to change. And certainly if we create a vision, if I create a vision of my business getting to a certain level, what do we do when it gets there? hopefully we create a new vision. You know, it's human nature to always want to grow and thrive and do more. So again, it's absolutely a process. And it is a process of asking questions. If I was coming into your organization to help you with creating or refining your vision, really, it's like business therapy on some level. It's coming in and asking questions. The vision questions for me are mostly focused on identifying a point of time in the future and identifying what it is you want to have accomplished by then in all different areas. So going further forward, but also going broader. So, you know, I said, you know, if I had a vision to double the income in my business, well, that's great. But part of the question process would be why? What does that mean? You know, it's great. You've doubled your income. What kind of opportunities does that create for you, to create for the other people in the organization? What kind of contribution are you now able to make to your community, to your other stakeholders as a result of doing that? So, you know, a vision isn't like this tunnel vision kind of thing. We want to go broad and get, you know, the level of excitement and passion people have about a vision is really connected to how broad it is, how it isn't just a money vision, because that's not that inspiring. But if that increased income gives you the opportunity to make more contribution to your community and to bring in more people and to expand into different areas of business, all these things that can happen because of the money, that to me is where people really get excited. And then on the value side, in my experience, again, it's a process. It's the same thing. When people really do good, solid values work, I don't think there's as much change. You know, the values that would drive an organization, there might be some kind of fine tuning, but in general, with individuals or organizations, if they do really honest, you know, not just trying to come up with the right answers, but really coming from your heart about what's really important to you and the contribution you want to make, those values will continue to drive through, you know, multiple visions, multiple levels of growth and expansion and contribution. So it really is, you know, it's a process of asking questions and going deeper and going broader to excavate those kinds of things, if you will. And then one more distinction about the values piece in terms of the work that I do is I look at values from two different perspectives. One is kind of the roles that we play, either individually or organizationally. So for me, if you ask me what my highest values are, the first thing I'll tell you is my family. You know, my wife, my children, that's my highest value. That's a role in my life. If, you know, it's the planet and the people on the planet is a very high value for me. My health, but these are all roles. These are like what is important to me. And there's another side of values work that I try and separate because I really think they're two different things. And the second one is what I call ways of being. So I can also ask myself the question, what's important to me? And look at it in the sense of how I show up in the world. Like, it's really important to me to show up in the world in a loving way. It's important to me to show up in a way in the world of high integrity. It's important to me to show up in the world in a way of being grateful and appreciative for all the blessings I have in my life. So these are ways of being versus roles. And what I try to do when I'm working with individuals as a leader, or, you know, they may not even perceive themselves as a leader, but after we do this work, again, in my eyes, they are a leader. Those are the distinctions about values that I try to help people make. And what I see is a lot of times people kind of muddle those things up and get them kind of overlapping and confused, when in fact they're very different distinctions of values.
I think I'm going to have to go back and listen to that multiple times. Dad, we lost your audio if you were just trying to talk.
Sorry. So how long does it take for someone to put together and start test driving a set of typically I'm doing mission, vision, and values. So mission, why they're in business; vision, where they want to go or grow; and then values, how they do business. How long in your work does it typically take to put those together?
That's a hard question to answer. And the reason why, in my experience, it's a hard question to answer is because organizations vary so much. It kind of goes back to the conversation that we were having about Ford and about the Bookends piece, about where they're starting and where they're finishing. So sometimes I'll go in and work with an organization that's already done vision and values and mission work. And what we're really doing is refining. one of the things that I see, like I just did some work with a construction company recently, and they were like, oh yeah, we've done all that. This whole vision values thing, yeah, we've got it all. I'll just email it over to you. And they did. They sent me what they had come up with. They had worked with a consultant and gone through and done what they called their vision and their values and their mission kind of work. But what I saw through my lens was that they had done a lot of goals work. What they were showing me was their goals. And to me, the difference between goals and vision is kind of that narrow versus broad. You know, they had very specific, very measurable, and goals are great. And goals are powerful and important to have. But it's not a vision. Like there's a difference between a goal and a vision. And to me, the difference is narrow, goal, broad, vision. And so we had to kind of go back and start from the beginning with them. Not completely start from the beginning, because it was good that they had these goals and that helped kind of lead the process. I have also worked with organizations like this biotech company I'm working with in San Diego right now. I'm going in and working with their customer service department. One of the questions I asked them is, vision and values, what's already in place. And they were able to direct me to a page on their website that had a great example of really clear vision and values and mission work that they had done. So not to dodge your question, but for that biotech company, it took me next to no time, really. I just basically checked in with them and made sure that what they had in place kind of met my criteria. I didn't feel like I had that much to add to it, other than the next piece that we're going to talk about, which again, you teed up perfectly. Spoiler alert, the next criteria I want to talk about is the leader's ability and willingness to communicate effectively what those vision and values are. To get into the weeds, to get into that, you're past the first bookend, you're into the game now, to be communicating effectively and staying focused on the vision and values, letting the vision and values determine the way we think, the way we act, the decisions we make, and ultimately the results that we get. So, it can be a very quick process. In general, I would say if I'm going in and I'm working with an organization, most of the organizations I work with are not huge, because that's another thing that will determine, if I went in and was to do some work with Ford on their vision and values, you're talking about getting a lot of people involved in that conversation and probably taking months to do it. A lot of the companies I work with are fairly entrepreneurial. They're relatively small. They have pretty tight leadership teams. So I could go in and in a couple of weeks do some really powerful vision and values work with them. So did I dodge your question or answer it?
I don't know the answer completely, but let's move on to your fourth thing, because we're running out of time. So
okay.
The fourth thing here is the communication piece.
Right. So number 3 and number 4 to me are very, very closely connected. Which chicken and the egg, which comes first? A leader, it's great if they have really clear, vision and values, but if they're not able to communicate that, if they're not able to share it effectively, I think collaborate is an even better word than communicate in this case. And again, the Ford example that Jeff shared, it sounds like a really good example of someone who came in and not only had a vision, but did a really good job in a really difficult situation to think about sharing vision and values out through an organization the size of something like Ford is pretty incredible. Like, you've got to be a really good communicator and collaborator in order to be able to do that. And it sounds like he really is. And to me, if you have the vision and values, but you're not a good communicator, you're not a good collaborator, then, if I went in and did weeks or months or years of work to develop the most powerful vision and values and mission statement ever, it's a big fat waste of time if there isn't someone who is effective at communicating it and collaborating with their people to implement it. You're talking about, organizations that have it up on the wall. I always think of fraternity houses, the fraternity houses that have this beautiful plaque up on the wall with the values, and then in the basement they're doing, hazing and drinking and drugs and, whatever's going on that's completely out of alignment with what that plaque on the wall says. And it's the same thing with organizations. Sometimes there's just not an alignment with how a leader shows up, with what really goes on in the organization versus that, beautiful page on the website or plaque on the wall. So communicating it and collaborating effectively would be the fourth characteristic on my list.
Okay.
That sounds
Jeff?
pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And again, I think we covered some of that with number 3. It really is the logical next step. And I don't think anybody listening would argue with the fact that if you have a really great and clear sense of vision and values, but you don't communicate it effectively, you know, that's just not going to be helpful. So,
Or live it out.
yeah, exactly. You are the segue king. You want to
Yeah,
go
he
right to
is.
number 5?
Yeah, let's hit number 5. Yeah.
Live it
Come on.
out. Live it out. Number 5, right here on my list, integrity. And I think this, of all the characteristics that I really lean on, this is the one that's probably most in alignment with a more kind of mainstream, typical vision of an effective leader. You know, even that kind of more masculine, you know, you'll do it that way because I told you to do it that way, which, you know, the truth is, in my experience in business and in life, there's a time for that. Like when you're in crisis, when there's an emergency, when someone needs to make a decision and we need to get into action now, one of the things a really great, effective, powerful leader can do is make a decision and get us into action right now. Because we don't have time to pause and go back to the mission and the vision and collaborate and all that. It's called, we got something that's got to get done and it's got to get done now. And sometimes that's a really powerful leadership move. And we would want that person to make that move in integrity. They would be asking us to do something that we know they would do themselves. And to me, if you're not the kind of person who walks their talk and is willing to do the same kinds of things in the same kinds of way that you're asking your people to do, then I don't see how you can ever be an effective leader. You know, you might get through those moments of crisis, but in the long run, in terms of really inspiring people, creating a great culture, being an effective leader, I think integrity, although it's the 5th one on the list, it's probably the single most important one to hold it all together. Because if a leader does not practice what they preach, I just don't see how they can ever, in the long run, get the respect and the trust that they need to be able to move an organization forward, create ultimately the results and the experiences that they want to create.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think that you hear the word integrity and you think of being honest. Is the person honest? Yeah, that's totally important that they're honest. But integrity also means that when I promise I'm going to get you something by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, I get it to you by 5 p.m. on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
I contact you and let you know that I'm running late, and I give you a new date, and I don't miss the second date.
Right.
And because those are standards, that you brought it up. The standards require of other people, we have to be the role model for. Leaders are role models, and people learn more from how you behave than what you say.
Yep. And that's a really great example. I think most leaders expect their people to do that. If I tell you I need something by Monday at 4 o'clock, I expect you to have it. But if I don't do that myself, there's a real problem. There's absolutely a real problem. There's a breakdown. There's going to be a breakdown in trust.
I think that's a really good place to wrap it up. What do you guys think?
Well, I think
yeah, I think so, because like Rob said, I mean, it's number 5th on his list, but if you can't be a role model with integrity, none of the rest of the stuff works.
Well, and I think again, this is my list of 5, and I don't intend this to be the all-inclusive, everything's here, you know, period, end of story. For people who are listening, who I know, you know, are connected obviously to you guys, but, you know, to me as well now, I'd love to hear from people. You know, what's missing from this list? What does someone who's listening to this conversation think is either missing or needs more emphasis in this conversation? Because I think the conversation about what really does make an effective leader is a really compelling conversation in today's world. In organizations, families, schools, again, nonprofit, for-profit, whatever, my experience is that if you really look at the results that are showing up, you can almost always trace it right back to leadership, especially if an organization's been around for a period of time. What you see on the front lines is going to be what's coming from the leadership of that organization. So it's just so critical.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is that particularly you brought up millennials or Gen Z even. So Gen Y is millennials, then you got Gen Z in college now, coming out of college. Those people are looking for truth. They've been raised pretty much in a postmodern world where there is no absolute truth, which doesn't make sense. That's an oxymoron statement. But they are looking for integrity, and they're looking for truth. They're looking for somebody they can trust, because they cannot trust politicians, and they cannot trust the media, and they cannot trust so many things. If you as a leader can be that person of integrity, as we've described, you can engage with these groups, and these are potentially the next great generations. They're looking for that cause to rally behind, that organization to rally behind, that they can trust, and it can really connect with them.
Yeah, and the truth is, in today's world, you can't pretend to be something and get away with it for very long, because information is so accessible. Everybody knows. So, yeah, I agree with you 100%.
Cool. Characteristics of effective leaders: powerful, open-minded, vision and values-driven collaborators, and with high integrity. Robert, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Great to be with you guys.
Thanks, Rob. Always good having you.
Namaste.
Whatever that means. Yeah, thanks.